Good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining us on a beautiful afternoon. Glad we could provide you a few minutes to finish your sandwich or whatever the case might be. Again, I'm Steve Faust with 3J Consulting. Happy to be talking with all of you again today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we're all looking at the same thing. Here we go with the fourth meeting of our project advisory group for the Clark County Housing Option Study and Action Plan. Just run through our agenda for today. In just a minute, Jackie is going to run through announcements from between the last meeting and this one. Then, as we did last time, I'll give a quick review of key findings from the housing option study work that we've done so far. Then Tyler Bump and James Kim from Echo Northwest have joined us, Tyler making a return appearance to talk a little bit about a middle housing pro forma that Echo Northwest worked on for us. Then hopefully you all had a chance to review the document we posted to the website, I guess, with proposed objectives based on all that work that we've done to date. And then we're just briefly going to touch on housing strategies towards the end of the meeting to kind of introduce the full universe of strategies that we're going to be working together through an iterative process to winnow down to the ones that we think are the best fit to come out of this particular project. We'll have a little bit of time for public comment and then move on to next steps. If there's not any questions about that, then I'm going to hand it over to Jackie to go through our announcements.
Hello, everybody. Jackie here. Just a few updates for you since our last meeting. Just wanted to let you know that we've provided some presentation updates to a few groups, including County Council and the Planning Commission, Clark County Planning Commission. So that was the first time since you all have begun meeting that we touched base with them and provided an overview of the work that you've heard so far. We also have given updates on the project as a kind of an introduction to the Neighborhood Association Council of Clark County. A really brief one to the Commission on Aging, which is a commission that both Jenna and I staff and who are interested in the project. The Schools Advisory Council. And we wanted to connect with you all about this and ask, and you can email me, or if you want to chat or send me a chat, if there's other groups that you think would be interested in getting kind of that intro piece. So we of course will be going out once we have something to share for feedback, but we're happy to also go out and do an introduction to the project. So if there are groups that you think of that would want that, reach out to us and we'll work on getting calendared for that. I know Kate had recommended, I think after our first meeting, some groups that would be interested. So Kate, if you let me know, like, is this a good time or should we wait until we have something to share with them? So those kinds of the questions that we'd like to know. I wanted to circle back on some data requests or questions that we've gotten over the past several months regarding ADUs and cottage housing. We're trying to get a good kind of feel and data piece on what we have in the study area regarding ADUs and cottage housing, so we can share that with the group. We also are looking at putting together a list and to be able to look at the types of housing that's been built in the Highway 99 area with that form-based code to see what the effect of that code has been on new housing, so we can share that with you as well. So we're working with various county staff on compiling that information, so it's coming. Let's see what else. We are working on a CVTV close-up piece that will also be an introduction to the project. So 3 to 4 minute piece. I'm going to be talking about, giving the general overview, the purpose of the project, talk about you guys, And then we've got Phil's going to talk about the challenges on the development side that he sees. And Kate's going to talk about, I got Kate to come and help and talk about the challenges that people are finding with not being able to find housing that's affordable to them. So hopefully we'll get just a good overview of the need and the problem and how we're trying to get to some solutions. So that'll run, I think, mid-May to early June. Lastly, just a kind of communications update. I sent on Friday an email out that directed you to our project library page where I've been posting some articles or resources that advisory group members or staff have shared. So in an effort to not like bombard you or email inbox, I'm going to try to batch it like this so that you don't get emails constantly from us. So there may be times when I need to send you something that's outside of that batch. So like today we received a comment that I wanted to share with you all from the public for this meeting. So depending on the timing, I'll try to batch, but if it's something kind of time restrictive or feels like I need to get to you sooner, you may get those one-offs. Let's see. Let's see what, Jenna, was there anything else I needed to add on the communications front?
I think just to clarify on the, there had been a request for sort of outside of this meeting communication.
Right. Yeah. So we're not able to come up with any kind of like county tool to allow interaction outside of the meetings. So please feel free to continue to use the roster to communicate with other members, as well as if there's articles and things that you want to share with us. I'm happy to post those, and then I'll let the advisory group members know that there's new stuff to check out on the project library page. Ron, Ron looks like he's got a question.
Just because this is announcements, perhaps this is the right time. I just wanted to remind the group that we have established 2 tours for Wolf Industries to go to the tiny homes. I had a signed up sheet go out, but if you haven't signed up for something, you're still available and you want to go, I have 2 times, tomorrow at 10 o'clock and then on Friday at 2 o'clock. And anybody who hasn't already received the information, but they're interested in one of those 2 times, go ahead and contact me and I'll just add you to the roster. There's room in both tours. And I think that would be very valuable for the team to see one of the methods that's already being used in the county. And we've been talking to Victor also about the idea of trying to put something together for the Elwood.
Yeah, I'm trying to coordinate with property management and staff at the Elwood for a tour next Friday, May 7th. So I'll send out a group email.
Thank you both. Jackie, did you have anything else?
Nope, that does it for me.
All right. Thank you for those updates. And this is just a brief refresher of findings to date. We'll walk through these pretty quickly since we've heard it all before. But again, we started by understanding the issues, identifying housing challenges within the Vancouver UGA, unincorporated Vancouver UGA, and opportunities to encourage development of housing that is affordable to a variety of household incomes through the removal of regulatory barriers and/or implementation of other strategies. We have thus far conducted stakeholder interviews to help understand some of those issues and opportunities, conducted a housing data analysis to understand trends in housing production and demographics, and then the policy and regulatory review that we went through at our last time to understand what some of those barriers might be to encouraging a more diverse array of housing types and price points. So from the stakeholder interviews, some of the key things that we heard from the people we interviewed, a feeling that recent construction does not reflect local needs, especially in terms of the predominance of single-family homes relative to the demographics. Permitted residential uses and locations do not always support needed housing types. Many people felt that the land supply is constrained and encumbered, making it difficult to provide more affordable housing. That maybe there's a lack of infrastructure where new housing is being built or planned to be built. The sequencing is maybe not always ideal. That the review and permitting process can sometimes be siloed and costly. Impact and development fees are not necessarily scaled to the size of development. And then several people just mentioned the importance of working towards equity and kind of supporting all different types of housing and not favoring any one type over the others. And since we have Tyler here today, he's agreed to run through these slides again, rather than me doing my best impersonation of Tyler doing it. So go ahead, take it away, Tyler.
Sure, thanks, Steve. So I'm going to hit some of these high level points that we presented to you all at our last presentation, but just to sort of set the stage for some of the conversation that's coming up today. So on the housing data, housing needs side, more than 50% of households make less than 120% AMI today. Many low-income households are renters. About half of renters are cost burdened, and cost burdened households are those that spend more than 30% of their monthly income on housing costs. More than half of the households are 1 and 2 person households. So a lot of households are smaller households. It's not inconsistent with other areas of the region, but generally quite a few households are 1 to 2 person households. 84% of residents leave, or workers in the study area leave by car for work. So a lot of folks are commuting out and in. And most of the housing stock is generally single family detached. I think about 3/4 of the housing stock in the UGA is single family detached housing. Most housing units are above 1,500 square feet, and most of that housing is on 5,000 square foot lots or bigger. The charts over here, real quick, Steve, I think are a good representation of some of the existing conditions where the majority of housing units are 3-bedroom or bigger units, and the majority of households are in the 1 and 2 person household category. So bigger houses, smaller household sizes is that sort of dynamic that's happening throughout the UGA. Next slide, Steve. Most households are at 60% of AMI or below. Most households at 60% of AMI or below need to rent. And part of that's a function of resources necessary for a down payment or to qualify for homeownership loans. Although there are programs to help support homeownership at different income levels. New multifamily units rent at about 80% MFI, or about $1,800 a month. And about 42% of households earn 80% of MFI or less in the UGA. The median home sales price for housing is about $343,000, which is generally about 112% to 130% of MFI, and about 65% of UGA households have incomes below that level. In general, rents and home prices are increasing, and we showed that last time. Some of them are increasing pretty quickly, and rapidly exceeding wage increases throughout the UGA as well. There's some information on the right-hand side. It's an example of affordability and MFI levels. A lot of information I won't go into, but it is available in the slides and the reports as well. Next slide. So this is sort of the crux of the charge, honestly, of part of this work is what is the future housing needs and what our housing needs look like by income category. And so the UGA has a housing need, a 2035 housing need of about 13,280 units, 281 units specifically. And about 53% of that total housing need is under 120% AMI. So the bulk of the housing is needed at 120% AMI below, which would generally be considered workforce housing or affordable housing below 120% AMI. And that under 80% AMI, so more affordable housing needed, about 32% of total housing is needed for households earning 80% AMI or below. But also a large chunk of households and housing units needed at the above 120% AMI category, with a little over 6,200 units in that household income bracket of 120% AMI and above. Next slide, Steve.
Thanks, Tyler. I think that's it for your portion of the presentation. I will quickly cover what we heard last time in our regulatory audit. So I think from this slide, the important thing to note is that 89% of residentially zoned land is zoned for low density, just 8% medium and 3% high. And then of the buildable residential land that's available, 84% is urban low density land. So that's what the capacity is right now. A few things in terms of development code in low density zones. Again, that's the predominant zone that we see in this area, and is predominantly single family detached homes. Relatively low densities limits the number, variety, and affordability of homes. Lot development standards allow ample building area that could facilitate a range of middle housing types. In the medium density zones, we see a greater housing variety permitted, but constrained by maximum densities. Minimum lot sizes are out of sync with those maximum densities for some housing types. And then there's a limited land supply that's in demand for small lot single family, which tends to crowd out the middle housing alternatives. In terms of middle housing opportunities, looking at a different approach to density to allow more units and more variety of units on the same size lots as single family detached homes would be needed to support middle housing. Recent changes to accessory dwelling units and cottage housing have expanded options. There are some challenges to duplexes and townhouses as they are currently permitted in the code. And then triplex, quadplex, and courtyard apartments are not explicitly permitted. And then high density zones, there's a very limited land supply, and development opportunities are often constrained by competing site demands, such as the amount of required parking and open space requirements. And then finally, for commercial and mixed use zones, we know that there's existing opportunities for vertical mixed use in these zones. There's the limited high density land supply might be pushing demand into commercial and mixed use areas. And then there are opportunities to create a mix of uses in these areas through strategic residential zoning, expanding horizontal mixed use opportunities, and permitting residential uses outright. So things to think about and consider. So now in a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler to present this middle housing pro forma feasibility analysis. This is really the last piece of the study portion of what we were scoped to do. And I think the work that Echo Northwest did previously gave us a lot of great information and also raises a bunch of questions that I'm sure people would love to get concrete answers to. We are somewhat limited in how much we could look at for this exercise, for this pro forma exercise. And you'll see in a minute that it had to do, Tyler will better explain kind of what the scope of this pro forma was. But I just want people to know that, we were limited in how there's a million different variables that we could look at, or combinations of those variables. And we had to be somewhat strategic in our approach to this. And so we thought that the framework that Echo Northwest provided here would be helpful and help us think about other variables as well. So I probably rambled on long enough. Tyler, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Steve. And I'll dig into what we looked at specifically a little bit later on in these slides, but I do want to provide some overall framing. Is that this feasibility analysis, and when we do exercises like this, is really meant to answer the question of, if we allow different housing options, will it get built? So if you entitle it, will they come? And that's part of the question that we're answering here. We are, to Steve's point, we did focus in on a couple housing types, which I'll go through in a second, with townhomes and duplexes, and a couple specific zones to test some policy options and development standards to be able to support more of these housing types, with the goal of specifically thinking about creating more housing options for entry-level homes that are attainable to a wider range of folks currently living in the county, the UGA, or that will be moving to the UGA over the coming 20 years or so. I guess 15 years at this point through 2035. So with that, Steve, next slide, please. So we wanted to provide some context for why we're looking at this and why it matters. So some high level things that are related to the slides that I went through at the beginning of the presentation, but housing is getting expensive and entry level homes are becoming increasingly out of reach for a lot of folks in Clark County and throughout the UGA. Increases in housing demand have outpaced housing supply for many years, and that's reflected in the current housing gap that we identified from the previous work, so the underproduction numbers. Creating more housing will make homeownership more attainable. Most places are zoned for single family development, so looking at different development options that are currently allowed today, or how to better achieve different development options, and evaluate if townhomes and or duplexes are effective options for entry-level homes attainable to more housing. And that's the focus of our analysis. Next slide, please. So the key question is, what would it take to create homeownership opportunities, housing options that are affordable to households in the middle of the income spectrum? So in the 80% to 120% of AMI. So what happens if we allow or make changes to allowed uses? What happens if we change lot size minimums? And what happens if we change parking requirements? These are the things within the development standards and the zoning code that, based on a lot of this work that we're doing across Washington and across Oregon, that we're finding have the most impact on, at least from the code perspective, on creating more feasible development of different housing types. Next slide, please. So a little bit about policy options about what we're looking at. So we're testing two different development types. We're testing townhomes in the R18 zone. And the reason for the R18 zone is it's the most common zoning designation in the urban medium comprehensive planning area. Duplexes and multifamily developments are allowed in the zone today, but townhomes require review. So we're looking at testing different policy options to permit or allow townhomes to a greater degree in the R18 zone. Duplexes in the R16 zone. The R16 is the most common zoning designation in the urban low comprehensive planning area. The R16 zone has seen development of mostly detached single family homes, but duplexes are allowed on corner lots today. And one of the questions that we're evaluating is, would we see more duplexes if they were allowed more broadly through the R16 zone? Next slide, please. So this is just sort of a matrix at looking at some of the standards and that we're looking at in the status quo versus the townhome and duplex option. There's actually quite a bit of information in here for a simple matrix, simple table. The R18 townhouse options are the top two, and the R16 duplex options are the bottom two. We have policy options A, B, and C. A is the status quo, so what's currently allowed today or the current development standards in these zones, and then testing alternatives for lot size and parking requirements for townhomes, and then lot size changes only for duplexes. So for the R18 minimum lot size today, it's regulated by density dwelling units per acre, which gives us about a 2,400 square foot lot size per unit. And so we're testing specifically 1,500 square feet, a minimum lot size in the R18 zone. But we did do some sensitivity testing that I'll show a little bit later on between different options for minimum lot sizes. For the townhomes in the R18, we are testing also a parking reduction from the current 2.5 spaces required today to 2 spaces in the townhome in this option B, policy option B. The 2 spaces that we're testing, our assumption is a garage space and a driveway space to meet that 2 parking space requirement, which fits with the townhouse development type, physical development type. In the R16 zone, there's a current minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet per unit. And for duplexes, we're testing 3,000 square feet per unit. And the parking required for duplex currently is 2 spaces per unit today. And so we're not testing any changes to the parking requirement in the duplexes, given the ability to meet that requirement with the site size and the physical requirements for the development on these sites. Next slide, please. So a little bit of high level background about what is a pro forma analysis and what is development feasibility analysis and what do we mean. A pro forma analysis is used to compare the financial risk and return for different real estate projects. So it's a way for us to look at comparing townhomes to duplexes, comparing duplexes to single family, comparing higher density multifamily development to single family, and see what changes in regulations can support different housing types and development types. The things that inform this are really two key buckets of information: development costs. And in our development cost category, we have the cost of land. We have what we call hard costs, which are generally considered as labor and material as hard costs. And then soft costs on the development side, which are things like architectural and engineering fees, permitting fees, and impact fees. And then on the revenue side is the sales or rental revenue from a project. So how much can you sell a unit for? How much can you rent a unit for? Do those revenues overcome the development costs of land, hard and soft costs to make a project feasible? We have a simple example of a pro forma on the right-hand side of the slide that sort of breaks down how we look at the revenue and the costs. And then ultimately, we're looking at total profit before taxes as the function of a feasible development project. So again, if your revenues, your net sales income and your revenues are greater than your costs, we're showing that we would assume that that would be a feasible development type or a feasible development project. Next slide, please. And then just to explain the sort of metric that we use for feasibility, we use a metric called residual land value. And residual land value can really be thought of as a land budget for a development project. So if you were to take your development costs, your expected rates of return, cost of construction, and potential revenue from a construction project, all of that works. At the end of the day, what is your land budget to be able to pay for this thing? So we use residual land value as a way to compare different development types to each other. And then on the right-hand slide, we've got an example of, in the blue bar, total development value. So this is the revenue side of the equation. And on the left-hand side, we have the development cost. And so this chart, this is an example of what we would call a feasible development, where the development value is equal to or greater than the costs. If that dark blue bar were lower, that would indicate that the development value is less than the cost, and that would not be feasible development. So just a little bit of framing about when we say feasible development, what we're looking at, what it means, because it will inform how we're able to communicate the next few slides here. So next slide, please, Steve. All right, and now the really interesting, fun part of this work is the results of the feasibility analysis. And we have in policy option A is current standards for townhomes, excuse me, and we have our physical assumptions and some of the price impacts and AMI levels for each of these under each policy option. The way to interpret or read this chart is that the orange line is the average land value that we're looking at for residential land in these zones across the UGA. So in order for a development type that we're looking at, these policy options, to be feasible, that blue bar wants to be at or above that orange line so that you could pay for the land to make that development happen. If you are further below, the further you are below that orange line, the less feasible that development type is. And so what this analysis shows us is that policy option B, which is the 4 townhomes with the smaller lot size, is feasible. So that change does increase feasibility from the current standards. Again, the current standards for townhomes are policy option A. So greatly increases feasibility, makes townhomes more feasible in more places across the UGA. Policy option, the difference between these two policy option Bs in the middle is that we're looking at an ownership product or a for sale unit. In the first policy option B, the tall bar that has $28.89 per square foot in residual land value, that's an ownership option. That means that's super feasible. Policy option B, the second one, the $9.36, is a rental product. So that means that given cost of land, in most cases, it would be difficult to develop a townhouse as a rental product within the Vancouver UGA. And so the findings of this are pretty consistent across what we're seeing in other markets across the Portland region, where when there is a strong market for ownership housing, that townhomes as a middle housing type generally are the most feasible and the most likely development type to occur, just given the strength of the ownership market of where we are right now. So not surprising findings. Policy option C is the duplexes on a 6,000 square foot lot as well, is more limited in feasibility. That doesn't mean, one of the questions that I often get when I present this information is, I've seen this development type happen. I've seen a duplex happen. Even if we show that these things aren't feasible, sometimes they happen for some different reasons. There are developers out there that are what we call more vertically integrated in their business models, where they might have general contractors as part of their business model, and they're able to minimize costs on the construction side. We have folks that might have acquired land 10 years ago, so their land basis is lower, so they can make that happen. So there are reasons that development happens, even though it doesn't show it being feasible. But what this does tell us is that duplexes would be challenging to make work in the R16 zone as we're modeling it today, given current land values. Next slide, Steve. So one of the things that we did on, given how feasible townhomes were on the 1,500 square foot minimum lot size that we evaluated, is did what we call some sensitivity testing. So what if we look at different minimum lot sizes for the same townhouse prototype to see at what level does that become feasible? And generally about 2,250 square feet per unit as a minimum lot size is that threshold for feasibility. Given the uncertainty in the market, we would probably make a recommendation that minimum lot size per unit needs to be reduced to at least 2,000 square feet per unit to encourage or support townhouse development, if that were the goal of that you're trying to achieve as part of this housing action plan. And that as you decrease the minimum lot size, that makes development more feasible as well. But that 2,000 square feet as a minimum is kind of the baseline that we would, given the analysis, recommend as a minimum lot size to be able to make townhomes work more often throughout the UGA. Next slide, please, Steve. So key takeaways, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. I want to leave room for questions. In most cases, current zoning regulations limit the production of ownership housing for middle income families. And some of the things that we've looked at specifically in townhomes will help improve that. Duplexes can be built on smaller lots, but today's market is unlikely to support them. Market conditions could change in the future. Townhomes are a feasible way to support homeownership for middle income families. And to do so, you want to think about parking requirements being reduced to 2 spaces per unit or less, and minimum lot sizes to be lowered to 2,000 square feet or less. There are also many other policy scenarios, which Steve mentioned, that are not evaluated as part of this analysis that could help create more attainable housing, both on the code side as well as on the program side, to be able to support more attainable housing, more housing in general for current and future households in the UGA. So with that, I think I will open it up for questions, Steve.
Yeah, definitely. If people have questions for Tyler and James as well, or you have some thoughts or reflections that you want to share in light of this information. Nancy.
Yeah, so currently, as I understand it, duplexes are usually sold as a unit, meaning if you buy a unit, you get 2 units, two dwelling units, and if you buy a triplex, you get 3. So are you suggesting that duplexes would then be split up so that 2 people can buy the duplex separately?
Yeah, so there's duplexes happen in a couple different ways. They could happen, as you mentioned, as you buy a duplex, you either rent both of those out, or you live in one. You know, there's lots of different ways that happens. The other option is through an HOA and a condo. So there are duplexes and triplexes that get built as condos, where it's not what we would call fee simple development. So you don't own the land, but there is an HOA associated with that, and it still is an ownership product.
Since no one else is asking, I
Go ahead.
have another question. So the townhomes, if they're on a 2,000 square foot or less, based on your models, they would be what, 1,500 square feet, or they would be like doubled up? Like what would did you guys drill down on what type of townhomes that would be? Like single level or double decker or triple in many cases?
Yeah, James, maybe I'll have James chime in on our assumptions on the physical. James, if you're able to chime in on the unit size and the number of stories and some of the other physical parameters for the townhomes that we model.
Yep, I am here. I was having my video off because I was having a little bit of internet issues, but And to answer your question, we looked at the typical townhomes we were considering were 3-story ones with 1,700 square foot living area, probably 1 or 2 garage spaces on the that you can access through the main street.
So in general, so the townhouse prototype that we looked at is, we looked at a couple different ones, a 2-car garage and a single car garage. Our assumptions for the townhome for a 1-car garage is about 1,500 square feet in residential floor area. That's the sort of square feet of the unit, not including the single-story garage or the single-car garage at 3 stories. And I think those were 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath units at about 1,500 square feet that we looked at for the townhomes.
So in consideration of the aging population, is there any possibility of having the these townhomes, but instead of doing 1, 2, 3 per unit, to do 1, 2, 3? That way, that would allow older people to perhaps live on the first level. I mean, this is just thoughts to kind of think outside the box, because Silver Wave is here. And we need to also think about housing inventory and availability for the older people. Just a thought.
Yeah, that's a great comment, Nancy. And I might kick it back to Steve and mention that what you just described is kind of a cottage cluster housing type, where there are options to be able to think about housing types within a bigger site and what a cottage cluster might look like, programmed in a different way that doesn't have 3 stories, but might have a larger number of units on a site.
Yeah, definitely something we can consider. We're getting a lot of variations or just, thinking about other variables. I don't know if you saw the chat, but someone mentioned, things might be more feasible if you were under a community land trust model where the land value is separated from the cost side. Or on the flip side of that, if it's a homeowners association, the fees could be an issue that might make something less feasible. Any thoughts on those 2 points, Tyler?
Yeah, I don't know. We haven't looked at the cottages specifically and testing the feasibility. I think the cottages could be helpful. It's hard to say without looking at testing the feasibility of the cottages for sure.
Sure. Ron's got a question.
So it has the appearance that you stayed within the confines of existing policy and development regulations. Did you project how much of a change or an impact that what you're proposing would have in the context of where we saw the information saying how much particular housing stock needed to be made over a particular period of time with this pro forma?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we didn't, the whole goal or intent of this analysis was to try to figure out how to create more housing affordable to households that are in the 80% to 120% AMI category. It's really challenging to be able to use the code to try to produce housing that's affordable below 80% AMI. So usually trying to get to a deeper level of affordability, I think we talked about this as part of the housing needs analysis portion of our presentation a couple of weeks ago, usually requires public subsidy to get to deeper affordability. But in general, for the townhouse units, this is an effective way to get more middle income housing built within the UGA without requiring direct subsidy or public subsidy to be able to make that happen. And it depends on the unit size, Ron, in many situations. So folks, we looked at a 1,500 square foot sort of prototypical unit. Bigger units are going to be more expensive. Smaller units are going to be less expensive on a nominal basis. There's going to be different feasibility challenges between them. The reality is if you allow this sort of thing to happen, you're going to see a variety of sizes that meet the needs of the market wherever the demand is, if they're feasible. So I do think it is helpful in reducing housing costs and increasing housing options for a wider range of household incomes.
Brian, go ahead.
Oh, hi, this is fascinating data. Thank you for it. I'm still kind of digesting it. A couple questions. One was if sort of the picture that you're painting of the townhomes being where the feasibility opportunity is that, how does that look elsewhere? Are we somewhat unique or not really? And I also just wondered in terms of, you had talked about some of the costs, in terms of the, say, an average single family house in the study area, what percentage of that, based on your data, is cost of the land? I know there had been a study years ago, so it's fairly ancient in the county, that it was about 16%. And that was maybe 20 years ago, so I expect it's higher, but just wondered what you're seeing.
Two good questions. I'm going to answer the second one first while it's on the top of my head. We didn't specifically look at the land price versus the improvement value of single family sites throughout the UGA as one of the questions that we looked at here. What we did look at for our average land price as that threshold, that orange bar, was really predominantly vacant sites within the UGA, and the price that folks have paid for land, or what the going market rate is for land of developable residential land that's vacant. And certainly if you were thinking about a redevelopment scenario, depending on the conditions and the site specific conditions itself, that price could be different. And so I think the $11 is a best case scenario where you've got vacant buildable land that could be built with these housing types. In terms of, our townhomes, is the townhome feasibility being the most feasible development type unique to the UGA? It's similar to what we're seeing in other parts of the region. So we just did a presentation we're doing some work for the unincorporated portions of Washington County right now. And we're doing it for HB 2001 compliance on the Oregon side, doing some feasibility testing there, where townhomes are also the most productive housing type. And a lot of that has to do with just where different parts of the region are within the housing market, and gets to some of the conversation that we had at the last presentation again around the Clark County and the UGA specifically being a place where folks look to for more accessible homeownership options within the region. And that is part of the driver that's making townhomes the most feasible, is that it's just the rental rates in many cases for new construction aren't there to overcome the development costs associated with some of these middle housing types. That doesn't mean it won't happen, but the ownership market is strong in the UGA, and the ownership market is extremely strong right now. Just in general, it's kind of bonkers, but prices have increased so much and sales prices are so high that it's the most feasible option in many places, and specifically in the UGA.
Let's go to Jackie and then John.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Tyler or Steve, what your experience has been with smaller townhouse lots in the driveway, with the lack of on-street parking and the kind of the challenges with parking with that kind of smaller lot development. Is it alleys? Is it something else? Have you seen what can work well?
I'll let Steve try to take a crack at that, and then I'll use some of the things that we've learned from other housing action plan projects.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, certainly this is something that we've been looking at a number of our projects in Oregon, and how we balance the desire for on-street and off-street parking, and what was I going to say? Oh, individual places, garages or what have you, versus kind of group parking somewhere on the site. I don't know that I have any specific thoughts on what works well or not. I think I could loop back with Elizabeth. She would have, more concrete thoughts on that topic.
Steve, if I may, I do have one example of just thinking back on some of our code work with Elizabeth regarding on-street parking and the opportunity to work with driveway spacing around duplexes and townhomes, and organizing it so that there is, instead of a double driveway entry for a duplex or two townhomes next to each other, there are separate driveways that allow for a curb in front of the unit for parking on street. So there are some opportunities around driveway spacing and curb cuts.
Thanks, Annie. John or Tyler, did you have something you wanted to say before we go to John's question?
No, I'm sort of dipping my toes in Elizabeth's territory, and I don't want to do that too much. But one thing that um, I think we've seen in other places, the sort of driveway curb frontage and the parking requirements, the physical development type, has so much to do with the lot configuration. And so you might have situations, especially in the unincorporated portions of the county, where you might have a real deep and relatively narrow lot, where you might have townhomes that are more oriented with a drive aisle, that could tuck under, that's oriented different to the lot. And so there are, the parking situation is very site dependent, I guess, is the moral of the story, and that there are different development standards, and street frontage development standards that will impact how developers and the builders sort of respond to those regulations in different ways.
John, go ahead.
I was just going to piggyback a little on what Tyler said previously about why townhomes, and part of it is because we don't see any affordable condominium development in Washington because of challenges with getting those insured. If you look at other parts in the country, I was looking at real estate in Nashville. Do you see a whole lot of one-bedroom condos that are coming on the market at a relatively lower price compared to the rest of their inventory? But we don't see that kind of development here because of a lot of the state regulation issues. And so without that potential of an opportunity for that entry level ownership option, kind of townhomes is the next jump. So part of it is some state barriers that prohibit that entry level ownership option and push those into more, apartment construction versus ownership options.
Thanks. Let's go to Sirk, and then Ron, do you have your hand raised again, or is it a residual hand raise? Okay.
Was that a residual or not? Tyler, have you had a chance maybe in your work in other places to run an analysis like this where you would allow for townhomes or duplexes outright in every zone? Or to maybe say it another way, have you had a chance to look at what happens if we specifically eliminate single family zoning as a zone and then see what happens with the market? I think you'll largely get higher density housing, but just maybe go with minimum lot sizes potentially, but eliminate a single family zone and see what gets built. And some of it might be duplexes. A lot of it will probably be townhomes, but have you had a chance to do any sort of analysis on that?
Yeah, quite a bit with HB 2001 in Oregon, just because of the new requirements of HB 2001 for cities over 20,000 require that all single dwelling zoned parcels allow some form of middle housing. So we are testing these at a citywide scale for single family housing. And you're right that in most situations, the denser housing type generally performs the best. On the ownership side, that continues to be townhomes in most of the situations for ownership. On the rental side, we do see triplexes and fourplexes performing pretty well on the rental side, just because the math works better when you start to get 3 or 4 units and they're not as big as townhomes, and you might have smaller lot sizes that are allowed for fourplexes. We've also looked at some work that we did for the South King County Housing and Homelessness Partnership, a sort of unconstrained by zoning development feasibility that looked at both middle housing types and wood frame and podium construction. And the middle housing honestly works really, really well in most locations. And so it was interesting to see if you looked at an unconstrained scenario that didn't have minimum density requirements, that didn't have sort of density limits in the single dwelling zones, that middle housing as a product type works really well across communities when you have housing pressures.
So I'm sorry. So rather than saying eliminate single family zoning, what should I call it? Unconstrained? What's the term that won't send people off their rocker?
I think allowing a greater diversity of housing types within existing single dwelling zones is how I would characterize it. Because the reality is that in most cases, you're not prohibiting single family zoning or single dwelling development, right? So you're allowing single dwelling development, and there will continue to be demand for detached single family housing. So I think there's a connotation that by saying it certain ways, you folks can interpret that you don't allow single family, or that single family won't continue to happen, or that single family as it exists today in many situations will just convert to multifamily uses, and that's not necessarily the case either. So more of a communication strategy, or communication approach than anything else. But yeah, there are places specifically in Oregon with HB 2001, the state legislative changes from a couple of years ago, where cities are going to be required to do middle housing in all single dwelling zones.
So you're saying that does have a positive impact on driving some more middle housing?
It certainly does. And I'm trying to think, we're doing a project in Eugene right now also, where pretty much across the city, we see that middle housing, there's of course existing development feasibility for single family housing under existing single family regulations, but that allowing middle housing gets an additional bump on adding additional housing capacity. And it is pretty incremental, but it does support more housing over time too, and different housing options for folks over time. Our reports are available in both Washington County and Eugene. I would sort of point you in that direction if you're interested to see it, like at a broader jurisdiction level, if you allow middle housing more broadly, what are the impacts look like? Because a lot of the Oregon cities are dealing with that question right now with their requirements to satisfy HB 2001.
I've seen several questions or comments in the chat about, did you look at this? Did you study that? I mean, just to reiterate, our scope and budget for this task was pretty limited. So we picked some variables that we thought would be enlightening to our process. And I think we can continue to, check in with Echo Northwest and Tyler, like Tyler said, looking to other places where they've done work or they're aware of other data as we go through our process of recommending strategies or policy changes for this project. But we just so everyone knows, I mean, we will not have the capacity to continue to test the feasibility of all of the strategies that we might consider. I did also want to respond to Nancy's comment. Again, this study didn't look at, I think what you're referring to is like a home conversion, where you kind of create an accessory dwelling unit or multiple units. But that's certainly, I'm not sure what the county regulations are around home conversions, but that's certainly something we can put in our initial list of potential strategies and talk about it some more as we go forward.
Yeah. Steve, real quick on that point, on Nancy's point, I will note that we have looked at internal conversions for allowing multiple units within not in the UGA, but in other projects. And that there are, beyond the zoning code and development standards, there are building code issues with how to effectively do that, especially once you start to trigger the commercial building code, which is a challenge. But it can be a way to create more housing options. But in general, most housing is produced by builders and developers that do new construction. So that's one of the reasons that we look at new development, is because that is the source of the most of the new housing that is created in our communities as well.
Tyler, to the extent that there's any of your reports that maybe went beyond what this study does in terms of the scope of your pro forma analysis, and you think the takeaways would be valuable, I've been asked to add, some of your reports to our library. So let's follow up after this meeting. And if there's any specific ones that you'd recommend we look at and we might be able to learn something from, let's get those into the library.
Okay.
Anything else for Tyler today and James? Nancy.
A couple of points. You were saying something about building code, maybe violations or challenges in regards to conversions. Now, if it's a home, say like 4 or 5 bedrooms and beyond, converting that into an additional apartment, so it'd be 2 apartments, would be essentially like converting it into a duplex. So that would not be a commercial per se, right? Commercial is 4 units and above, or 4 or 6. That's one point. And the other is, have we explored people living living smaller? If the stats are saying that most of the household is 1 or 2 people, then do we need 1,500 square feet for 1 or 2 people? Something just to consider, because Americans were used to living big, but maybe it's time to start thinking smaller. Just something to throw out. Thanks.
Thanks, Nancy. I think that's definitely one of the key things that we're looking at, is actually, as we'll get to in just a minute here, Well, thank you, Tyler, and thank you, James, for joining us. We appreciate you jumping back with us. And again, just so everyone knows, you might not see Tyler again, but he and the ECHO team will be continue to work with us along the way and be available as a resource to us as needed. So thank you. All right. I'm going to move us forward to our next agenda item, which is some proposed objectives. So based on everything that we've heard, which, the stakeholder interviews, the data analysis that we got from ECHO Northwest, the regulatory and policy audit and review from Elizabeth at Jet Planning, from this pro forma information, our team worked with Jackie and Jenna and the planning team at the county to say, okay, what does this information tell us in terms of where we should be focusing our efforts? So I'll walk through these 4 proposed objectives that will kind of frame our work going forward, and then we'll open it up to discussion. Is there something we missed? Do we need something in addition to what we've proposed? Yeah, I really want to hear from you on if you think we've captured the focus for what we think we should be focused on based on what the information we've heard tells us, or whether we need to make some changes. So the first objective that we proposed is to encourage the development of housing to meet the future needs of those not being served in the current housing market. I think this stems primarily from that chart that Tyler shared with us again earlier today, showing the different income levels, and our discussion that we think the 120% AMI and higher, the needs of those folks are largely being met by the market, while those under that kind of threshold are not. So that was our first objective. Second, to encourage a diversity of housing types by expanding middle housing options and increasing multifamily feasibility. This, again, drawing back to the predominance of single-family detached homes, and that we do not believe that single-family detached homes are meeting the needs of all of the residents in our study area. Third, encourage the creation, to Nancy's point, of a broad range of housing sizes to match the needs of all types of households. I will note that this includes households of different sizes and the different categories you see there: families, single students, older adults, disabled, homeless, or other unique population groups. So we know that we need housing of all sizes, but we also did want to just note what Tyler mentioned earlier today, that we're seeing very large homes built, while our demographics tell us that a big percentage of our population is 1 to 2 person households that aren't getting served very well in the current market. So kind of looking at a broad range of housing sizes, but still taking a closer look at the housing to meet the needs of 1 to 2 person households. And then finally, guiding development of diverse housing options to areas with access to transportation corridors and transit, commercial services, schools, and parks. And conversely, supporting development of those same amenities in areas where housing is located and more housing is added. So this was our attempt to respond to the information and the key takeaways that we heard from the data gathered to date. But I would like to open it up to hear from all of you if you think these hit the mark, or if there's some key points that we might have missed, or some modifications we need to make. Brian.
These are very good objectives. I no concerns about those. I just think, as given the limited time and scope of this process, it might be worth at this stage calling out something that references the nonprofit sector. Because certainly in Vancouver, we're not seeing, and I think this is everywhere too, a whole lot of houses in the 80% AMI or lower built by the for-profit sector, and that's no criticism. That's just the way it is. So I think it's worth having, and I don't have language, but something that recognizes that, and that some of our efforts going forward, because of the different dynamics with the nonprofit sector, to call that out in an objective. Thanks,
Brian. I think that is a reasonable, something we could accommodate pretty easily, kind of noting that we're working at the price, at the low and middle income ranges that we're talking about. That's going to be for-profit and nonprofit developers. Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It has the appearance to me, and looking at what Tyler was showing, there's ways to try and heat up the middle market, 80% and above AMI, but we're talking about that $325,000 ownership range up. I think a lot of the bullets here, really what we really need to do is be able to say who specifically we're trying to serve with whatever changes we're looking at. And I think we're going to have to get our place in line here of making proposals that are policy changes to really make a difference on what we're hoping to accomplish through the spectrum. So I think to Nancy's point, and you've got this here about focus on 1 to 2 person households not being served by the current market. I think we have to be able to make enough policy change that other styles of dwelling units could be built, or the ideas of how we're going to somehow create smaller units and make them feasible in some fashion. It's going to take some of us changing the focus and the policies of the county and making these proposals go back to cities as well, I think, to be able to have an opportunity to really make a change here. When we talk about broad range of housing sizes, if we did nothing in the way of policy changes, the most we're going to be able to do is the elements of what Tyler was showing and proposing. And I think we would all kind of agree within this group that after all the time and effort we've been looking at, that would be inadequate to only be serving 80% AMI and above. So I think each one of these bullets, we need to be able to look at saying, what can we do in the marketplace as it stands? And then what do we need to do in the context of policy changes to accelerate or enhance the opportunities to make this feasible in some fashion? And I think there's a lot of work that we could do in the idea of, if we have targeted price ranges that we're dealing with groups of people, and we're asking developers to come in and take a risk in building in those ranges, we've got to give them some forms of incentives. And those incentives, call them in the context of policy changes, or in some fashion, trying to help motivate the market to come into place. So we've had a little bit of discussion about this, but the idea of minimum lot size versus maximum lot size, parking. I think we even need to have a discussion about the idea of the limits on the height of buildings and the number of floors that are put out. Hazeldale going along the Highway 99 strip close to the I-5. There's certainly a lot of opportunity for us to build up to higher numbers. And when we start doing something like that, then we're also serving the middle market in a different fashion. So I think what we really need to do is break this down a bit more and really start to talk about who gets served, who doesn't get served. And with that, then we would have an opportunity to start, once we have those targets and who we're actually targeting, we would be able to measure how well we're doing.
Thank you, Ron. So I guess what I'm hearing you advocating for is a next step in the process where we get more specific with these objectives. I'm just wanting to understand specifically what you advocate the next step to be. Do you think more work needs to be done before we begin discussing specific strategies in terms of identifying what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think so. Let's just take the first bullet as an example. Those not being served in the current housing market. Well, if you're looking at the idea of available inventory for sale, some people might say that nobody's being served right now because the inventory is so tight. But if you look at the idea that houses are continuing to come on the market, maybe that's not the case for this group to need to worry about tackling that, that the market is driving that for 100% of the AMI and above, and we don't need to worry about that. What happens between 80% and 100% of AMI? Are sales taking place? Is inventory being built? If we say the answer is currently no, then we would look at maybe some of the Eco Northwest proposals in the context of being able to do that. When you get down below 80% AMI, you have to have a rational discussion about, is there any inventory that is really ownership model down at that range, or are we really in a position of saying that we're really needing to create affordable rental inventory? And that right there, who's not being served in the current housing market, that's 3 distinct groups.
Yep.
All right. So yes, I think we need to get more focused on that. We may find that there's some groups that we're just going to say the market drives the determination and we don't need to worry about it. Or in some cases that the subsidies are so great that we don't think that policy changes by themselves are adequate. And there needs to be partnerships between the nonprofit sector and the public sector. And we'll let that go.
Thanks, Ron. I want to make sure, plenty of people have time to talk, but I also want to just for all of us to be thoughtful about, to number one, if we have specific ideas on, that are more specific than these objectives, we'd like to hear those. I don't want to make this a contrary statement. We talked about certainly when we were pulling these objectives together, like, oh, should we give a specific income range? But we do recognize, like you said, that there are multiple groups not being served by the market, and we don't necessarily want to focus on just one of them. So I think there's that balance to wrestle with as well. We have an opportunity to make a fair amount of recommendations that can, make different types of housing more feasible, or change our regulatory structure here. And do we want to focus on just one targeted group versus making sure that we're looking a little bit more broadly and making sure that we're doing what we can with this effort to address housing needs for different income groups across the spectrum, or different household types. So just something for people to think about. Go ahead.
So Steve, I hear what you're saying, but I would have to say the presentation from Eco Northwest was exactly that, right? It only tackled 80% AMI and above, and it only got into home ownership really in the 100% range realistically. So when we look at the idea of doing this, I don't think we should be afraid of saying there's some areas that we're going to be able to move the needle on, and there's some areas that at this point in time, without dramatic policy change, we're not going to be able to move the needle on. I think this group needs to be forthcoming enough to be able to tell all the public officials and everybody that is looking at the outcome of this, where we're able to actually have success and where we're not going to be able to have success without a bigger input from the community.
And I guess I'm saying now is the time to say what those are specifically. This is our opportunity to say this is where we need to focus our efforts, because after today we're going to start moving into identifying strategies to help meet our objectives. So to the extent that people do have specific thoughts on that, we'd like to hear them. I think, John, did you just raise your hand?
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Yeah,
I think I'm agreeing here with Ron that I think the land could be free and you still can build purchasable options at that 80%. It's just the construction costs and everything else is so great that to talk about ownership option at 80%, you could get a free piece of land and you still couldn't do that. So I think that's kind of what I heard you saying, Ron. I think, yeah, we need to be realistic about, at that point, we're talking about rentals and we're probably talking about subsidized rentals if we're going far below 80%. The other comment that I wanted to make on this slide, I think it might be helpful to start having a conversation about specific areas where we are wanting to target these strategies. Because when you look at all of the unincorporated Clark County, the strategies that will be effective on Highway 99 are not going to be the same strategies that will be effective in Orchards, and they're not going to be the same strategies that will be effective, you know, in the 179th Street area, where there's now just a lot of land that was just brought into the urban growth area at Urban Holding and Lifting, and so it's more greenfield, fresh development. So talking about where do we want to target in one or two of those areas? Do we want to target infill, or do we want to say, let's work on a housing plan for the Highway 99 corridor or the 179th Street area and look at what strategies fit for the land that's there and the type of development that's going to be happening, because they're just too different to have a one size fits all that meets those different areas.
Thank you, John. Victor.
Yeah, so on the home ownership, so there are organizations that serve that 60 to 80% AMI for home ownership. Proud Ground comes to mind, Habitat for Humanity, but they use subsidy to help the home buyers. So, you know, the home buyer is still purchasing that $400,000 home. They just get, you know, $150,000 in down payment assistance so that that payment becomes affordable to them. But the issue now is that they're getting outbid by folks that, you know, moving elsewhere that can actually, you know, go 75,000 over list price. So that's the issue for a lot of, you know, low income home buyers. But there are people out there looking, so I wouldn't rule out people under 80% AMI for home ownership opportunities. And then as for this list, I think we're missing, I would like a specific call out for low income housing. I think we just need to put it out there. I feel like middle housing, when I think middle housing, I think 80% and up. I don't think below 80%. So, you know, you asked to have a public housing representative on this board. If you're not looking to serve people below 80%, I sort of asked, why am I here? So that's all I will add.
Thank you. Very important. Thank you. Stefan.
Well, I haven't been sure when the best time to bring this up was, but probably now. The discussion has almost entirely been focused so far on dwelling units, and Clark County has been growing like many suburban areas in a way that there are discrete commercial areas and everything else has been developed as purely residential. And this is not exactly a high-tech idea, but where I grew up, there were small commercial blocks in the middle of residential areas. And actually, when Philbrook Farms was developed 3-4 years ago, there was a set aside for a block that could contain 4 or 5 commercial establishments. It's never been developed that way. But when you look at the fact, number one, that the population is growing older, something that Nancy Dong has said a lot about in her chats this afternoon. The fact that climate change demands that we reduce vehicular dependence, and the way that development is occurring now, especially with older people, the way that's been solved is to bus people to places like Highway 99, but not to bring small commercial facilities closer to them, which would allow people to get more exercise and reduce pollution. I think this is something that needs to be considered, as especially in the areas, let's say, up around 179th near I-5, where we're talking about almost entirely new development. We can start designing neighborhoods with these small dispersed commercial blocks incorporated into them.
Thank you for that. Appreciated. Kate.
So I did just want to echo what Victor shared and the importance of specifying low-income housing, and even more specifically, you know, very low income and extremely low income housing. I'd also recommend that in the third bullet that homeless not be included in there. I feel like it's specifying household types and wouldn't identify homeless as a household type. That's a description. And it's something that is, doesn't identify someone in any specific way, in that people who are homeless are just as unique as any other population. I think if you want to call it out, it would be more appropriate in the diversity of housing types. And really would love to see more specifically that we're looking to expand housing types for those who are low income, very low income, extremely low income, most specifically. So thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I appreciate that. Other reflections on what we've heard from other panelists or other advisory group members, I should say. Jackie, did you have anything you wanted to share or reflect on from what we've heard thus far?
No, great discussion. This is exactly what we wanted to hear, to be able to include a broad range of objectives that cover all that we want to cover. So good discussion, and we would like to come back, or Steve, how do we come back, I guess would be my question on updating and revising these.
Yeah, I think, I don't want to cut our discussion short right now, but I think we'll regroup with you after this meeting and look at all the comments that we've received and come back at the next meeting with proposed revisions. We might even send them out ahead of time so that people can take a look at them. Others, thoughts, reflections on what we've heard regarding these housing objectives? Oh, okay, Nancy.
Sorry, I just have a lot to say today.
That's okay.
I was just in the process of typing. Perhaps we can have two approaches. One is new build. And, when we build new, we can, sky's the limit. We can decide, how to, do we want cottages? Do we want townhomes? Do we want duplexes? But I think it's equally important. We already have houses that are, that exist. And does it make sense for one person or two people to live in a 3,000 square foot home? Can we somehow change the code, make it more flexible so that homeowners, if they wanted to, can add density so that they can invite their best friend and live in the apartment under the same roof, but still have privacy? I think we need to kind of think outside the box of how society is evolving and how we don't need to be in the McMansions anymore. And I'm just inviting everyone to kind of like think in that way. I'm thinking about, for example, turning my home into like a 4-unit thing. So just so that I have a little small community here, or for passive income, for a lot of older people, this may be an issue, and that brings the square footage down. So it makes it more affordable. So I think that's something we really ought to consider as well. I think it's really good to also think about adding density. Adding new units, but maybe have a two-pronged approach. Shut up.
No, thank you, Nancy. We appreciate your thoughts. Anybody else before we move on to our next and final topic for today? Okay. All right. Well, you also in your packets received a document to just very initially begin our conversation around strategies. Our intention was to kind of focus in on those objectives today and come to some agreement on those, and then start looking at strategies that can help us achieve those objectives. We've started internally to put some strategy ideas together, but at this point, it would certainly be an incomplete list. What we thought might be helpful to start is this framework or guidance that was provided from Washington State Department of Commerce, a whole list of potential strategy types to be considered. And there's 6 of them: revising zoning standards, additional regulatory strategies, process improvements, housing incentives, funding options for affordable housing development, and other strategies. And I'm just realizing now that I can't see my notes when I'm presenting. So give me a second to pull up my notes on this topic so I can read from those. So the first category that we have here is, sorry, I just gotta get this out of the way, is revising zoning standards. So you can see a list of those here. Each one of these categories has a number of initial ideas on strategies that we might pursue. This category includes strategies for regulating building heights, density levels, and permitted uses. So that's the first category. The second category is additional regulatory strategies. These include adjusting other regulatory standards, such as parking requirements, setbacks, and design standards that can affect the feasibility of projects. The third category is process improvements, strategies to provide for a smoother, faster, and/or a more predictable permitting process for developers seeking to build housing that is consistent with county goals. So that is the third category. Fourth category is housing incentives, strategies to encourage and support multifamily and affordable housing development, particularly income restricted affordable housing, such as fee waivers, multifamily tax exemptions, or inclusionary zoning. Our next category is funding options for affordable housing development. These are options for directly funding or subsidizing affordable housing production, including grants, loans, and new revenue generation. And then finally, other strategies such as strategic infrastructure investments or programs to support homeowners with ADU financing, design, permitting, and/or construction. Many strategies are most effective when implemented with the support of partners. I think we talked about partners a little bit earlier today. So those are the different categories of that provided from that guidance document from the Department of Commerce. What we want to do is to start to populate these different categories with your ideas on strategies that we might want to pursue. I'm wondering if, and I'm going to go back up here, if our intent was to, starting with the next meeting, to really start diving into potential strategies in each of these, under each of these categories. I'm wondering, to start off, if there is a particular category that people think would be a good one to start with, to start our discussions about strategies and help focus. Any of these categories jump out at folks as a good place to start?
Number one, this is Carol Collier.
Number one, Carol. Certainly we can pull
Yes.
Elizabeth Decker back in to help us revisit some of the issues that she raised around zoning. Other thoughts?
I concur. Revising zoning standard is the basics.
The base?
Yeah, the base.
Does anyone disagree with taking that approach of starting with looking at zoning standards? I've got a hand raised from Ron.
I think that we will find some leverage with almost each one of these items, but they're going to be more beneficial to different constituencies depending upon what it is we're looking at. I'm almost wondering if you would be willing to go back to our discussion about the breaking out of the households by AMI and look at maybe creating a matrix where you have Z1, Z2, Z3, or O1, O2, O3, and put them into the matrix and say where you think that they would be most beneficial. That would really help us, I think, in the context of targeting. And I know that, the state has said specific strategies, but when I remember when I was reading about it, they were really talking about in the context of either trying to go towards, I think the phrase was workforce housing on one side, which I believe is rental type units, or the idea of low income or home ownership, trying to drive down the price of the entry level homes. And I think what we would be able to do then is look at those and say, here are particular levers. Some of them are in common with right across the board, and some of them are really leveraged for only one particular type of housing stock. And it would help us, I think, somewhat focus.
Thank you, Ron. I like that idea. I think that's something we can do. I think like you said at the end there, I'm not sure that, I think there are some strategies that might apply across the board, and then other ones that are more specific income levels. So I think that's something that we could do to help organize this conversation. And then what we want to do is not only kind of organize these, which is why we started with this framework, but also, this group's going to meet until September, and we want to make sure that we come to you with bite-sized chunks that we can tackle one meeting at a time, and then kind of narrow our list of possibilities down to what will be this group's recommendations. So I think that's something we could do. Stefan?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that prioritization. I was just thinking that my suggestion about small dispersed commercial, mixed use blocks probably belongs in the zoning standards discussion.
Okay, and that brings up a good point. Thank you for that. To the extent that people have specific thoughts and ideas on strategies that they want us to investigate and raise for consideration for this group, I'd encourage you to email those to Jackie, and we'll start to build on this framework. And like we said, come back to you and probably a category at a time, or we'll figure out some way to make this not seem overwhelming. But we'll be developed, coming up. We have our own thoughts and ideas on strategies that we've developed from seen work in other places and that we think might work here. But we certainly appreciate your ideas as well. So to the extent that you want to put strategy ideas or policy ideas in the chat, that'd be helpful. Or if you want to email those to Jackie, that would be helpful too. Let's see. Victor, did you put your hand down? Did you have something you wanted to share?
Oh, I think you answered it. I was going to ask if we planned on doing like one topic each meeting over the next few months, or are we going to tackle like 2 at a time?
Yeah, I think what we need to do after this meeting, we wanted to kind of hear from you all today before getting set into a specific approach. So we'll work with Jackie and Jenna after this meeting to kind of lay out a path from May through September, and ending in September with some clear recommendations that we can move forward to Planning Commission and County Council. So I don't know what that is exactly right now, but that's the idea, that we'd kind of use this iterative process to start with a lot of possibilities and narrow down to the ones that we think are going to be most effective. Other questions, comments, thoughts on, Jackie?
Yeah, I kind of want to reiterate that if there's specific strategies are great and helpful, because if there's someone we need to bring in, like another county staff person that can provide some background, or another agency, we're happy to do that, or get some questions answered. So let's use our resources that we have. I've got a lot of fellow staff workers on standby to answer questions as needed. So keep them coming, and we want to be as prepared and give you as much information as we can for our future discussions.
Thanks, Jackie. Anybody else before we move on for today? I know there's been a lot of, go ahead, Jenna. Oh, we can't.
I also just wanted to mention, what if, some of us know more about some of these things than others. So if I don't know much about a category, should I let you know that as well? Or what's the best path to communicate that if it's not something I could necessarily weigh in on right now?
I mean, certainly, I think letting Jackie know, or letting any of us know through this through, during the meeting, we certainly can, as, again, don't know exactly the path we're going to take, but if we take one of these categories, we'll do our best to make sure we're providing all the information that this group needs to make informed and educated decisions as we look at the various strategies. So, but if there's a particular area that people think that they need a little bit more education on, we can, if they let us know, email Jackie, and we'll make sure that we build that into our presentation before we, discuss specific topics, strategies. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Well, we are going to move to public comment then. Let me scoot back through my slides, and this time I'm going to remember to pull up the public comments. I know we have one hand raised, but click for those who are in our attendee group, just raise your hand if you'd like to speak, and then I will call on you and unmute you, and you'll have about 2 minutes to make your comments, and then please lower your hand when you're done. So folks, if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand, and I'm going to go ahead and unmute Jim Forbes. Jim.
I'm sorry, first time I've been on this.
No problem.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Great. A question about the new intervention by the federal government with the affirmative fair housing rule, which is going to come into certain communities. I understand it's optional, but is there any interaction with those folks? I know it's not well defined yet, but they're bound to be getting involved. And I haven't heard any discussion as to how that might impact the change in the land planning, because they certainly want to bring high density into some areas they consider to be discriminatory with low density.
Jackie, I don't know if you are more familiar with this topic than I am at this point in time, or actually if any of our panelists are. I know we've got a lot of expertise here, and happy to hear from whoever knows a little bit more about what's happening at the federal level.
Yeah, I'm not well versed yet. Definitely want to look into it, but I definitely open it up to any other advisory group members that might have some further knowledge on it.
Any of our panelists?
Yeah, the rule was actually passed in the Obama administration. It was suspended during the Trump administration when Carson was in charge of HUD. But it's in the Biden-Sanders manifesto quite clearly that they intend to get involved. Any area that receives federal funds is subject to being, and of course, almost everything has some type of federal funding. But something to be, I think, thought about, considered. They are planning on offering funds as well, grants, along with it, so it's not just a control type thing. So,
thanks, Jim. I think you might be referring to the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. Okay, yeah, we'll have to take a look in terms of what the opportunities are there. I'm familiar with it, but certainly not an expert on it. I don't know if anyone else in the group is, but we'll certainly look into what opportunities that might present. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other of our attendees want to use this public comment time to share questions or comments? Okay. Not seeing any hands raised. So with that, we'll move to next steps. So now, as you can maybe tell from today's discussion, we're getting into the heart of the process here, where we're going to work over the coming months to develop recommendations. Like I mentioned earlier, and Jackie mentioned, I think we'll go back after this meeting and kind of reflect on all the comments that we heard from you today and the ideas that we heard from you today, and craft a path forward. I think the matrix that Ron mentioned is a good idea that can help us just kind of structure things. And it sounded like the zoning category was a category that folks might be interested in kind of tackling first. So we'll definitely consider those two recommendations and everything that we heard from you, and come back to you next month with some revised housing objectives. Try to address the different comments that we heard from you today. And then we will, somehow frame and initiate a discussion with all of you to start talking about more specific strategies to identify specific needs. So just so everyone knows, we have a virtual public meeting scheduled for May 11th. Jackie, do we have a time on that?
I think we had talked about 6.
6 o'clock.
Does that sound? Yes.
I think
that's
so.
That's what we've got.
And the purpose of this first virtual event is to really kick off this project with the broader public and share a lot of the information that we've gathered to date, and answer questions and hear comments from folks. So that's what will happen. A lot of the same information you heard today, basically a very similar presentation to what we gave to County Planning Commission and County Council. The next meeting of this group is on May 25th. Again, we'll start discussing specific housing strategies. And then I just wanted to look ahead. In June has 5 Tuesdays. So Jackie, I wasn't sure if we're on the 4th Tuesday or if we're on the last Tuesday of the month, or if people have a preference on that.
I guess I would say stick with the 4th Tuesday.
Any objections to going with June 22nd? Okay, well, that's what we'll plan on then. We'll plan on June 22nd. And just before we close, appreciate everyone's thoughts and questions and comments today. Anything else to share before we wrap up and enjoy the rest of this beautiful afternoon? Not seeing anything. Well, thanks everybody. Appreciate your time, appreciate your ideas, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, everyone.